All right, welcome back to the Bible in Context. How's it going, Nate?
It's going well. Hey, we got a day and it's not raining.
It's cloudy, though.
But it is cloudy. It's supposed to rain tonight.
Yeah,
it has been raining.
Yeah.
We just caught a small window.
Yeah. Well, this time we're going to go dive into chapter 21, and we're getting close to the climax of the Abraham story. And there's going to be a lot of important things happening in this chapter, and even with the character that we just left, Abimelech, he's going to show back up in this chapter. And actually, before we dive into it, there's one thing I wanted to say that I didn't mention last week. We talked about how last week Abimelech asked Yahweh the question, are you going to kill an innocent people, a righteous people? And I think we kind of implied this, but I just wanted to make it clear because it's kind of the point of that question is Yahweh is implying, no, I don't want to. I don't want to kill an innocent people, which is basically the same thing that Yahweh told Abraham back in Genesis 18. He's telling him, I kept you from sinning, and I'm wanting to give you a way out of this if you are righteous and if you will trust my wisdom. So I just wanted to mention in there that whenever he asked the question, do you want to kill a righteous people? Yahweh's answer is no. And that's the point of that little narrative section.
Yeah, and I wonder if this is kind of setting up chapter 22 when God does something that seems on the surface very unjust, that maybe Abraham is being taught over and over through these different circumstances that, look, you can trust me, I am just. No matter what happens, trust me, trust my character, rest in my character. And that serves him well because he ends up passing the test in chapter 22. But yeah, I just wonder if it's somewhat of a setup.
Yeah, he brings him through these experiences to show him, like, look, I do care about justice, so
right.
I'm going to do justice even whenever it seems like I'm not going to.
Yeah, so you can trust in my character. I think Abraham gets it.
He finally does at the end of his story. So
yeah.
We just got through a section where he didn't so much and selling out his wife, but going forward, I think he's going to do a little better in this story.
Right. So we ended chapter 20 with the resurrection of the wombs of Abimelech's family.
Yeah.
And that leads us right into chapter 21, where we have an even greater resurrection of a womb, Sarah's womb.
Yeah, I mean, throughout the whole story, just thinking from Abraham and Sarah's perspective, or even the reader, we know that Yahweh created the world, but maybe there's still this lingering question of, can God heal a dead womb? Can God bring a child out of a barren woman? Well, we learn in chapter 20 at the very end, yes, he can. So, like 2 verses later, we have, in chapter 21, Isaac is born.
The long-awaited, prophesied son of Abraham and Sarah.
Yeah, so chapters and chapters long waiting, and for Abram, decades long waiting for
25 years, right?
25 years is finally come to fruition. Yahweh has finally delivered on his promise.
Yeah, and that would have been a test in itself, just the waiting period, which sometimes he does well and sometimes he and Sarah don't do well.
Yeah, try to take it into their own hands, which, I think we're meant to sympathize with this a little bit.
Right.
Waiting 25 years for a promise, and the closer you get, the further you get away from being able to naturally have a child.
Yeah.
Because you're just getting older and older. And so I think we're meant to sympathize with this and to put ourselves into this situation a little bit so that we can see, look at us. We've been waiting 2,000 years for the return of Christ. Mm. In some sense, that just looks bleaker and bleaker. But we're to wait patiently, and Yahweh will come through on his promise. Jesus will return and come back.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, okay, they get this son, and they name him Yitzhak. Laughter.
He laughs. Yeah, laughter.
Yeah, so Isaac, Hebrew Yitzhak. So they have this son, they name him Laughter, just as they're supposed to. Yahweh has turned their laughter of doubt into laughter of joy. And Sarah says as much. She says, now they're going to laugh over me. So people are going to rejoice over her, be astonished because this old woman has now borne a promised son from God. Yeah, and
it's kind of like the people were laughing at her, and now they're laughing with her or over her.
Yeah, Hagar she became small in Hagar's eyes, so she was laughing at her. And that's not said explicitly, but...
Yeah, it's implied. And just the culture back then. If you were barren, you were thought to have been cursed by God, and so... This is, at 90 years old, Sarah has a child. This has got to be the oldest woman ever to nurse a child.
Yeah. Yeah, we're told that Isaac, he is circumcised on the 8th day, so that's significant just because it's telling us Abraham is being faithful to the covenant. He's taking the promised son and giving him the sign of the covenant, of the nation of priests, like we talked about. If you haven't heard that before, and if you're just jumping in, you can go back to chapter 17, and we talk about how circumcision is a priestly sign in the Bible and in the ancient Near East, really.
Yeah, so immediately after God fulfills his promise that he made to Abraham and Sarah, you see the obedience of Abraham in a couple of ways. One, by obediently calling him the name that God had chosen, Isaac, and then secondly, being obedient to circumcision and just showing his loyalty to the covenant.
So whenever it comes time for Isaac to be weaned, which back in this culture is likely around 3 years old or so, kids start to remember at that point. That's weird to me. But anyway, they they weaned their kids usually around that age, give or take, I guess. And Abraham hosts a feast to celebrate the fact that his son is getting older, he's been weaned. And we have a scene here where there is some strife, some brotherly strife, wink, wink, between Ishmael and Isaac. It says, a lot of your translations will say that Ishmael mocked Isaac or laughed at him, something like that. It's that same root word that Isaac's name is built off of, laughing, Yitzhak. And so we have, again, the same wordplay continuing through this passage as the brotherly strife motif begins again. So, after Ishmael shows hostility towards Isaac, we have Sarah again demanding that Ishmael and Hagar be cast out of Abraham's camp, be sent away again. Now,
well, and I was going to say, we probably shouldn't be terribly surprised about this brotherly strife. I mean, this is what was predicted back when Hagar was in the wilderness last time, right? God, or the angel of the Lord, told her that she would have a child and that this child would be a wild donkey of a man and against his own kinsman. And so here we're seeing that play out. And this, of course, is going to rub Sarah the wrong way. Yeah.
Well, and even beyond that, I mean, the rest of the brothers throughout the story of Genesis, whenever we heard the angel of the Lord say, hey, he's going to be a wild donkey of a man who's going to have his hand against everyone, we should have been like, well, duh. That's been the pattern. So we're expecting this in the literary flow of all these different stories.
It goes all the way back to Cain and Abel.
Yeah. So yeah, we've been expecting this from the beginning and from the time of that word from the angel of the Lord to Hagar. So again, she demands that Ishmael and Hagar be cast out. Now, where have we heard that before?
This happened before with Sarah back in, what was that, chapter 16?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, she's repeating exactly what she'd done before. And so I think us as readers, we're supposed to, for a minute here, think, are we on the cusp of another fall narrative? Are they about to really mess it up again and send her out without sufficient reason?
Right.
So they're going to cast her out as in another Exodus event. And like I said back in chapter 16, I talked about how that Exodus that she goes through kind of gets put on pause and it's going to be carried out later. Well, here we are. We're about to have Hagar's Exodus finished. Well, okay, she demands that they be sent out, and she wants to cut him off from the inheritance of her son because she obviously prefers her son over the son of the slave who has been kind of her enemy in the past. Well, Abraham, we saw in chapter 17, he at least wanted Ishmael to be the promised son back before Isaac was born. He loves Ishmael, and so he's really troubled about the fact that he has to send out Ishmael, or at least his wife wants this. And so I guess he's sitting there debating if he's actually going to do this. And so as he's deciding, I think, again, we're wondering, is he going to, again, listen to the voice of his wife and send out Hagar, send her unjustly into an exile? But this tension is rescued as God comes in and he endorses this. And we find out this is going to be the means through which Yahweh is going to fulfill his promises from chapter 16, and that Abraham's not wrong to send her out. It's actually the good thing to do, and Yahweh has a plan to provide for her and her son.
Yeah, because he had already promised that he would become a great nation himself, and so for that to happen, he had to leave at some point.
Yeah, it picks up in chapter 13, reiterating that promise where Yahweh says, I will make a nation of the son of the slave woman also, because he is your offspring. Explicitly because of Abraham's care for his son and his relation to his son, Yahweh's going to bless him. I do think it's interesting there in verse 12 where Yahweh tells Abram, do whatever Sarah tells you. And so he's commanded here, there's a bit of an inversion on the typical seeing and taking motif, or at least from Eden, where Adam listens to the voice of his wife and Abraham in chapter 16 listens to the voice of his wife. There's a flip there. He says, yes, listen to the voice of your wife.
Right.
That is what you have to do to trust me in this instance. And we're going to see that again later, where Jacob, whenever he's about to go see Joseph. The patriarchs have been told repeatedly by Yahweh, don't leave the land. That's a bad thing to do. And then Jacob, he's about to leave to go see Joseph, and right before he does, he stops and prays to Yahweh, and Yahweh says, yeah, go. And so there's kind of this inversion. The thing that used to be a disloyalty to Yahweh is now an act of loyalty.
Yeah, and I think we're supposed to catch that and say, oh, that's weird.
Yeah.
And ask the question, okay, why? Why is there this flip? Why is he supposed to listen to his wife in this moment? Why is God okay with Sarah casting them away and exiling them? And he answers that question right here in the text, I think. Like you said, I mean, it's one, so that Ishmael can become a great nation as God had promised. But also I think this is, he talks about that it's through Isaac that the promises are going to be fulfilled. And so this is, in a sense, protecting Isaac from this brotherly strife that goes back to Cain and Abel.
Well, let me, since we're on this, let me press this a little bit. Previously in the Genesis story, when we come to instances of people listening to their wives, that according to a literary convention, not a literal convention, like, your wife has some wisdom, listen to her, but in the literary convention, it is typically a woman trying to entice her husband to sin in some way. Now he's told, yes, listen to the voice of your wife. We also have later Jacob, who throughout the Genesis story we've seen where patriarchs are supposed to stay in the land of Canaan. And then Jacob is going to go down to Egypt to meet Joseph. And right before he goes, he is told, yeah, go on down to Egypt. That's a good idea now. And the reason is because the elect one, Joseph, who's going to save the world, is in Egypt. And so the circumstance bends to bring that family to the elect one. Just like here, the elect one is Isaac, and we're trying to protect his inheritance. He's going to be the one that saves everyone, or at least his lineage. And so the circumstance is changing so that the elect one can inherit all that he is supposed to.
Right. And it's not that God's law necessarily changes, but depending on, at the end of the day, what's the biggest law? The most important law is God's will and his desire to see humanity redeemed. Mm-hmm. And so there are times where things he would typically not allow are actually what he needs or what he wants.
Yeah. And I think that's important to say. Like, all this is according to the redemptive plan that's already in motion. Like, the particulars are changing, but the overall thrust of the plan is still centering around the elect one and is staying the same.
Right.
And I think that's important just to bring up, because I could see someone saying, he told him just to do what he's been telling him not to do for chapters.
Right.
Like, this is just throw off all the rules. Who cares anymore? Like, this is pointless.
Right.
I don't know. Maybe that's helpful. Anyway, we've got Ishmael, who, because of his act of hostility towards the elect one, he is now facing exile out from the elect community, along with Hagar. And typically we would think, like, this is not a good move, because Abraham, according to the literary convention, the pattern that's been developing, Abraham's going to have to listen to the voice of his wife to do this. But God says, no, actually, I'm going to use this particular instance of you sending out this woman and you listening to the voice of your wife, even though her motives, we're going to talk about in a minute whether or not they're great motives. But anyway, Yahweh is going to use this instance to bring about her finished exodus, in a sense. It's kind of an inverted exodus, but still, nonetheless. And to fulfill his promises that he gave to Hagar about making Ishmael a great people back in chapter 16. So Abraham, in verse 14, he rose early, and we talked about last time how that's kind of a little phrase denoting haste or urgency. So now he is listening to Yahweh with some fervor, sending out Hagar and Ishmael just as Yahweh has instructed him. And then he takes some provisions and places it on Hagar's shoulder again. And I think this phrase is used to place on the shoulder in kind of a specific way. I think usually it shows up in places where you're talking about placing a burden on someone. To bear on the shoulder denotes bearing a burden. And you see the same thing where Seth and Japheth, they put the covering on their shoulder to go cover Noah, and so they kind of bore the burden of that sin. Later we'll see in the blessings in Genesis 49, I think it's Issachar as a donkey who bears a burden on his shoulder. So you see that phrase show up in different places where people are bearing a burden. So I think that Abraham here, he's putting a burden on Hagar. She is just having to bear the burden, I guess, of the sins of this family as she's being cast out.
And it's significant where she's being cast out, too. It's the wilderness of Beersheba, which is going to be mentioned a little bit later in this chapter.
Yeah, it'll acquire some really cool significance here soon, which this is on her way down to Egypt as well. So
right.
that's where she's kind of heading, even though she's not going to make it there all the way.
Yeah, so Beersheba is mentioned numerous times in the Old Testament as being kind of the edge of the Promised Land, the southern tip of the Promised Land. So she's in the she's still in the Promised Land, but she's a very southern tip heading towards Egypt.
Yeah. And so before we move on to talk about her experience and her son's experience in the wilderness, what about Sarah's motives here? She sees Ishmael teasing, mocking, whatever, Isaac, and then wants him gone. So I think there's really two ways to look at this, and I'm honestly not pinned down to either one. So one way to take this is like Sarah, she's being kind of petty. Yeah, this is a significant issue, but she sees one kid mocking another kid, and she's like, get him out, exile them from into the wilderness and let them die in the desert. And the other way to look at this is the word laughing or mocking. It's kind of cryptic in a way. It could denote something a little more sinister. We don't really know. Whether that's the case or not, maybe Sarah sees this as, okay, he is the seed of the serpent, and right now he is in line to inherit with the seed of the woman. And I need to protect Yahweh's promise and allow my child, the seed of the woman, to fully inherit the kingdom of God's elect, Abraham's household. So I'm not entirely sure.
I think it could be both. I mean, I think that maybe a little bit of both. I mean, often our motives are kind of mixed. I can see, there was already some tension that we saw earlier between Hagar and Sarah, and Hagar came back, and I'm sure that probably didn't please Sarah. And over the years, it's been several years at this point, that tension may have just kind of built and festered over time. So she may be in this kind of situation, just hypersensitive. Why is she even at this party? Who invited her? Kind of thing. And here now Ishmael is probably a teenager at this point, and she sees him, what she thinks laughing or mocking. Could be a little bit of mama bear in there, but it also could be, she's, like we talked about before, she has probably heard of and seen this pattern from the very beginning, since Cain and Abel, that brotherly strife. And if she believes the promises of God, that Isaac is the offspring and is going to receive the heir of the promises, then that may be part of her motivation too, is to protect the things that God had promised her.
Yeah, and we actually see, we'll see this show up in a few chapters where Abraham does the exact same thing again for the right motives. Yeah, I think it's just worth noting here. We could write Sarah off pretty quickly, but maybe she did the right thing for the wrong reasons. Maybe she did the right thing for the right reasons.
Yeah, or maybe a little bit of both.
Maybe a little bit of both, yeah. Regardless of that, Hagar and Ishmael, they head off down towards Beersheba, heading out of the Promised Land, and it gets to a point where they're in the wilderness and they run out of water. So they are dying of thirst, and Hagar decides, okay, I'm going to take my son who's dying of thirst and just set him a good ways off, and so I just don't have to watch him die and then go sit away from him. And then we have the Lord come to them. He has heard the crying out of the boy. And she as well, in verse 16, it says that she lifted up her voice and wept. So we have both her and the boy crying out, Ishmael, and Yahweh hears them. It's not the same word for crying that we see other places throughout Genesis or in the Exodus, because that's part of the Exodus motif, is the oppressed people crying out. So these are people who are now again kind of oppressed in this inverse exile, even though it was actually instigated from Yahweh. So he has a plan here the whole time. And he comes and sees what's wrong, comes and asks her what's going on. He hears the cries and goes to check it out, just like he always does.
Any thoughts on, so in verse 17 it says, and it was the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven. And so last time it was very explicit, like the angel of the Lord called. Do you think that there's a reason why the language changes here?
As far as the actual name change here, why it says the angel of God, the angel of Elohim, instead of the angel of Yahweh, I don't really know if there is something thematic going on here. It does seem to stick with God throughout this passage, but we do see down in verse 18 where the angel of God says, I will make him into a great nation.
Right, which is the same language that we heard back the angel of the Lord say.
Right, so Yahweh has already said this. So that this angel of God in this instant is Yahweh. This is the angel of the Lord.
This is the angel of the Lord. And that whole phrase, the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven, you're going to see the angel of the Lord called to Abraham from heaven in the next chapter.
Yep. So we're putting the angel of God and the angel of Yahweh in parallel. Yeah. Again, so showing these are the same people. And we also have two different gods here as well. And again, I think in this context, we're not thinking of little g gods, we're thinking of Yahweh, where it says, the angel of God said, "Fear not, God has heard you." I don't think the angel of God here is speaking in the third person, but just like we're going to see in the next chapter, we have God referring to God as someone who is as the same as him, but also different. Again, we're going to see that in chapter 22, so maybe the reason they're using God here is to just kind of parallel and set up for chapter 22. Put the question in your head so that when you see the repetition of, like, there's someone who's the angel of Yahweh who's speaking like Yahweh, but he also isn't. There's a different Yahweh as well. It's setting you up to expect those things.
Yeah, he is Yahweh, but he's distinct from Yahweh.
And maybe it's worth throwing out, since we're talking about this, that, again, The Angel of the Lord is, there's a book by Doug Van Dorn and Matt Foreman. Definitely check it out. It goes into a lot of this and shows where there's this character in the Old Testament who is Yahweh, but he's also separate from Yahweh, and how he shows up in the New Testament and just so happens to be Jesus. So that's what we're looking at here.
Yeah, we've mentioned that book before. Highly recommend it.
Yeah. So in verse 18, again, we have, "I will make him into a great nation," like we just said. So here Yahweh is reaffirming the promise to Hagar and to Ishmael. And then Yahweh goes on to open her eyes, help her to see well.
Well, it's similar language. And so in the next chapter, the ram, he lifts up his eyes, and behold, he saw a lamb. Or God provided a lamb. There's a lot of similarities, I think, that we're meant to see.
Yeah, that may be what's going on here with the well of water, where Hagar saw the well of water. It's that same word, ra. So maybe between the angel of God and the angel of Yahweh, and also seeing and being provided with a well of water and a ram, respectively, these may all be kind of set up for the next chapter, at least in small ways.
Yeah.
I don't know about that 100%, but just noticing these small things through the passage makes me wonder if some of that's going on, and maybe someone out there has done some more work on that to really solidify that theory. Take that with a grain of salt, but that might be what's going on here. Anyway, God goes on, and it says the boy grew up, he lived in the wilderness, and became an expert with a bow. So again, now we have the son who's non-elect, he's out in the wilderness, and becomes an excellent hunter, which might be a subtle callback to the mighty hunter in Genesis 10, which is Nimrod, which is not a good sign. That's not, not a good connotation.
Yeah.
And we're going to see that strengthened, because it's actually going to be a call to Esau as well. We'll talk about that when we get to Esau. The reason that's significant is because these characters are lumped in with the goat for Azazel in the two goats motif. So we'll talk about the motif again in just a second. He lived in the wilderness of Paran with his mother, took a wife from Egypt so he could continue his line and have the promise of becoming a great nation fulfilled. And that is where Ishmael's story just drops off, and we do not hear about him again except for in passing genealogical reference, which happens to every non-elect brother in the Genesis story. They go out to the wilderness, they start to become a great nation, and then they just fall off the face of the earth, as far as the narrative is concerned.
Right.
So here is where we kind of have that two goats motif for Ishmael wrapped up.
Yeah.
So just to run through that again, we saw where Isaac is chosen, Ishmael is the non-chosen brother, and then Ishmael shows hostility towards Isaac in laughing at him. Hagar is promised that he will become a nation, and Yahweh provides for him in the wilderness. So in that, we have that kind of protection element on him, just like happens to all the other Goat for Azazel brothers. The last time this happened was whenever Yahweh protected Lot as he brought him out of the city, gave him exodus out of Sodom. So then Ishmael, he's later exiled into the wilderness of Paran, so we have the non-elect brother in the wilderness again, where he becomes the Ishmaelites, so he does become that great nation, and eventually that great nation becomes an enemy of Israel, in that, one, they're part of Joseph being sold into Egypt, and also later in Psalms 83 we see where the Ishmaelites are a military enemy of Israel as well.
I wonder if it's helpful, just as a reminder and kind of review, the two goats motif comes from the Day of Atonement, right?
Yeah, so there's two goats at the Day of Atonement that are used to atone for Israel. You have the one that is the goat for Yahweh, who is chosen by Yahweh and then brought in as a sacrifice for Israel, and its brought closer to Yahweh, and its blood cleanses Israel. The other goat is also chosen by Yahweh because they cast lots over the goats to choose them, and he bears the sins of Israel out of the camp of Israel, out into the wilderness.
Yeah.
Carries the sins away. Now, with the two brothers, those elements, some of those elements are still present, and so there's kind of a link to the goats for Azazel, and there's also some more particular links as well. So we see where the brothers, one is chosen and one is not, and then the non-chosen brother shows hostility towards the chosen, is then protected in some way by Yahweh, but is still sent out into the wilderness, is exiled in some way, and then becomes a great nation who ultimately becomes an enemy of Yahweh's people. Meanwhile, the chosen brother is brought closer to Yahweh and is sometimes associated with a sacrifice. So we do have, we're going to have Isaac associated with a sacrifice. Joseph, Abel has been associated with a sacrifice. You can go listen to the respective episodes on that. And then there's also, we have so far Cain, we have Ham through Nimrod, we have Lot. All those are our goat for Azazel characters. And that we're going to see that continue on in the Genesis narrative. And if you listen to the specific episodes dealing with those characters, you'll hear there's some specific links in some cases that more closely associate a chosen brother with sacrifice or a non-chosen brother with the goat.
Yeah. Well, and I wonder if part of Sarah's motive, too, in this is like every time she saw Ishmael, she was reminded of her own sin. And the casting out of Hagar was, in a sense, a carrying away of that burden of sin that she was constantly seeing in front of her. I hadn't thought about it until you were just talking about that.
I hadn't either, and I really hate that I didn't see that before now. That's good, because, he places, if I'm correct about that little literary convention of saying placing on the shoulder is to bear a burden,
right.
Then just like Cain bore his punishment out into the wilderness, now Hagar and Ishmael, they bear a burden also out into the wilderness.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
That's good. Well, and I think we should mention here, okay, great, bunch of facts. What's the point? We're going to see the point even more so next chapter in the climax of Abraham's story. But right now, we've seen throughout the story that God still shows grace and care and mercy on the non-chosen brother. Being chosen, being part of God's chosen people, means that you are now the means for trying to rescue the rest.
Right.
It doesn't mean that now everyone else is hated and you're the special one. Yeah, so we saw how, all these non-chosen brothers, they're still being prospered instead of being destroyed. They're still becoming nations and being blessed. And so God's ultimate plan is not to destroy the non-chosen brother, but he's hoping to grow them, to make them fruitful and multiply like he wanted humanity to be, and then ultimately for the chosen brother to bring them back into the family.
So when we come to the New Testament, who's the goats? Who is what goat?
Jesus is both.
Jesus is both. Okay, explain that.
Yes. Okay.
So you've got Jesus being the sacrifice, and his blood covers us.
So there's a couple articles by Hans Muskik. One is Jesus as Scapegoat in Matthew, and it's about Roman abuse tropes in the book of Matthew to kind of show how Jesus aligns with the Second Temple understanding of the goat for Azazel. And then we also have one called Jesus, Barabbas, and the crowd as figures in Matthew's Day of Atonement typology.
Right.
And so in both of those articles, he shows from different viewpoints, in one case, how Jesus is the goat for Azazel, who both goats are chosen, and then he bears the sins of the community and is taken out of the community, and basically our sins die in his death as he bears them. Which really, there's some retranslations of some certain New Testament verses that would help with that. And then there's also the fact that Jesus did become a sin offering, just like the goat for Yahweh, and his blood was an atonement for us. So we'll get into Jesus and how he is both goats in the future, because we're going to see how Joseph is actually both goats, which becomes a typological prefigurement of Jesus.
Yeah.
But yeah, Jesus ultimately does become both goats as he bears our sins out and kills them in his own death, and then also how he becomes a sin offering for us. So we'll dive more into that at some point in the future towards the end of Genesis once we've talked about Joseph. But that's what this is building towards as well.
Right.
So yeah, that kind of wraps up Isaac's birth story and brings out some of the details in that and kind of shows the narrative expectations a little bit and wraps up Ishmael's story. So next we're going to talk about Abraham's treaty with Abimelech. I thought we were going to get to that today, and we did not. So we'll get that next time, but and then we'll be able to jump into chapter 22.
Sounds good.